Well, howdy there, internet people, it's Beau again. Today I just want to let you all know that I was the ringleader of a forced labor and human trafficking operation in Florida from 2005 to 2007. Our operation promised young and vulnerable Eastern European women from ages 19 to 23 the opportunity to work in the United States. We lied to them, telling them that they were receiving visas for working at one specific hotel for a specific period of time, so they believed that their papers were legitimate. But when they arrived, we took full control of their lives and forced them to work for our labor contracting business at whichever hotel paid us the most, making them unknowingly complicit in immigration fraud. We forced them to pay us massively inflated costs for things like visa applications, transportation, and job placements, which we garnished from their wages. One of our victims testified in court that we made her pay $1,145 for a visa renewal to allow her to keep working for us. Normally, such renewals cost no more than $200. We garnished $354 from her paycheck of a measly $600 in 1 week alone. We also had that same woman work for 80 hours in 1 week, and you can bet we did not pay her any overtime. We stuffed 15 to 20 young women from poor Eastern European countries into crowded apartments and forced them to pay us rent for the privilege. We ensured that they were completely independent on us, so they would have no choice but to keep working for us. We enforced all this with threats of violence, threats of fines, non-payment of wages, and verbal abuse, ensuring compliance from the people who we were exploiting in dozens of different ways. Our business was able to be competitive and profitable, specifically because we targeted vulnerable young women from poor countries, as we were able to offer the low bid on labor contracts from hotel companies because we paid them less than minimum wage. I submitted over 1,000 fraudulent visa applications for this purpose, and over 200 confirmed victims entered the USA to work for me on fraudulent visas that I procured for them, which they were led to believe were actually valid. My practices were very similar to those that Andrew Tate is accused of, minus the sex work, though on a much larger scale. What I did functioned in much the same way that forced labor works in the Gulf monarchies, which is commonly referred to as modern-day slavery. I have since never even remotely gotten close to admitting the full extent of the horrible things that I did. On some occasions, I've simply said that I'm a felon, which is very vague and covers the spectrum from drug offenses to mass murder. On another occasion, I admitted that I was convicted of alien smuggling, which is true. However, I left out all the details regarding the fact that the alien smuggling was for the purpose of forced labor. Naughty me. My intentional ambiguity has left some of my fans believing that I did something noble, like help to smuggle refugees across the border, rather than target vulnerable young women from developing countries so that I could force them to work for me for my profit. What I did was so severe that it's often used to this very day as an example of human trafficking and forced labor in Florida in educational material. I was indicted for my crimes on federal charges in 2007. Curiously, the prosecution chose to massively undercharge me, without any reason having been given for doing so. I was charged only with 1 count of conspiracy to commit visa fraud, 5 counts of visa fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit alien smuggling. It is very suspicious that, given that the prosecutor on my case publicly stated that they believed that they had more than enough evidence to charge me with forced labor and human trafficking, they opted not to. Specifically, they said that this qualified as forced labor because it involved the use of labor obtained through false promises, through threats of serious harm, or through abuse of law or of legal process. For example, threats of deportation, which we used. Nonetheless, I was convicted on all counts and still face a total of 65 years in prison. Yet curiously, after having entered a guilty plea, the state very generously decided to only sentence me to 41 months, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The massive undercharging combined with the incredibly light sentence is already quite suspicious, but it doesn't end there. For some reason, despite the fact that I had no leverage over the state whatsoever, they only decided to charge me $700, $100 for each count I was convicted of, and I was not forced to pay any restitution to my victims. In addition, the government sought $3.2 million in forfeiture from me and my henchmen, yet this was for some reason reduced to only $1 million, despite the fact that me and them had absolutely no leverage over the state for this to have happened. Even more curiously, even months after I had already been convicted and was imprisoned, the state decided to return multiple properties that it had seized from me. This is very irregular, given that I did not challenge those seizures in court or through any means for which public records exist. Usually, when the state voluntarily gives assets back, it's required to give a reason for doing so, given that said assets are technically public property. Yet in my case, in a highly irregular fashion, the reasoning was sealed, meaning it was kept private. This implies that something happened behind the scenes that made them incredibly generous towards me. I was released from my supervised release in 2013, early by the way, and I immediately started writing political articles and trying to build a profile for myself as an activist. Once other activists in Florida became suspicious of my past and the fact that I had rapidly inserted myself into politics, despite having absolutely no prior activist or political background, I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where I continued to do much of the same thing. Shortly afterwards, I created the Beau persona, and I very curiously chose to name it Beau of the Fifth Column. Fifth column means an infiltrator in a movement. Here's a video of me from my time in Cincinnati, where you can clearly hear my real voice.
When the revolution comes, when the fight comes, I'll be there on the day. The revolution's here. Blood is spilt every day.
Something I never mentioned is that me and my parents are actually well off middle class people from Florida, so my accent and persona are entirely fake. We lived on a 10-acre property in a 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom house. Given the fact that I'm a convicted felon, all of this is public record. Anyway, so I just wanted to finally come clean with all of this. I hope you'll all forgive me for my Gulf-style immigrant exploitation. And don't think too hard about how weird it is that I suddenly became an activist immediately following my release, after the feds gave me a long series of massive and incredibly generous breaks that they had absolutely no logical reason to give me if I didn't also give them something in return. In this space where people try to cancel others for quote tweeting them or criticizing them lightly, I do think it's pretty awesome that someone who ran a human trafficking and forced labor operation is somehow upheld as a pillar of leftism in the community without ever having actually reckoned with that past in anything resembling an adequate way. Ha ha ha. I can only imagine the skewering that someone who people didn't like would get for doing something even 1,000th as bad as literal forced labor and human trafficking. Anyway, I'll see you next time, internet people.